Economic exclusion of the previously disadvantaged people in South Africa continues to be pervasive. The National Treasury has admitted that the country has experienced low economic growth for almost a decade now, leading to rising unemployment and widening inequality. The government entity says there has been consensus to implement substantial structural changes in the economy to unlock growth that will allow inclusive growth and equitable development. Meanwhile, at a social justice summit that was held in October, Professor Thuli Madonsela said jobs alone do not create equality or end poverty. Now, Karabo Mashugane, founder and managing director at 2020 Insight, that's a company focusing on small business development and finance, joins us to share his insights. Great to have you. Thanks so much, Karabo, for joining us here on the program.
Morning, Leanne. Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So, despite the country's policies on affirmative action, I mean, we look at things like BEE, employment equity, I mean, there continues to be a great persistence and widening inequality and poverty gap here in the country. What is needed to boost the bottom of this economic chain?
Yeah, so I mean, just to go back to the statements that was made around jobs. I think, jobs may not necessarily be the end all and be all, but if we don't have jobs, then we really don't have anything. So they're a base and an enabler that we require. We've got to get it right. But I think with regards to, in general, our economy, the problem that we have is a lack of, I think, a clear sort of economic strategy. And that almost comes from a lack of a clear economic theory about how the economy grows and how it's supposed to grow. And what we instead have is a lot of, I don't want to say gimmicks, but it's a lot of initiatives that are announced here and there. I think in 2018, we had 500 billion that was supposed to go to setting up incubators around the country. We had the investment summits and things and commitments to try and raise $100 billion and then got 500 billion for COVID relief, and of late we've got the 130 billion for the green economy. So a lot of initiatives that get started throughout the different spheres of government, and I think no unifying sort of theory or strategy to bring them together. Despite the multiple sort of economic plans, etc., whether it's the NDP or the reconstruction plan that we have, etc. So I think that's really at the foundation of what our problem is. And if one sort of looks at it, if you consider, for example, what we have in monetary policy, we've got a very basic and a very simple economic theory at the base of it, that price stability is almost fundamental to economic stability, which is almost foundational, which creates a foundation on which you can grow the economy. And without that price stability, that your economy cannot grow. And we've seen it when there's hyperinflation, whether it was in Germany in the 1930s or Venezuela recently and Zimbabwe, that when you have runaway prices, that the economy cannot grow. So a lot of arguments around where the focus of the Reserve Bank should be. But I think it's clear that you need price stability to grow the economy. And because of that, you're able to then create very clear policies around achieving price stability, which is, in our case, it's a target inflation rates. And that makes it very easy for us to understand how the Reserve Bank is going to respond if expectations are that inflation is going to go either above or below the target rates on a sustained level. On the economic side, everybody agrees that we need to create jobs. Small businesses are key to creating jobs. But as to how those are done and how you grow the economy, I think we simply do not have a clear sort of strategy on that, and a clear theory, an elegant theory or a simplified theory that all of us can sort of understand and that will be able to respond, whether it's investors, whether it's small businesses, will be able to respond properly to that, to implement and to give force to the government policy. So I think that's really at the heart of the problem.
Let me ask you a simple question, something along the lines of, what is South Africa's competitive advantage? What can we leverage this country and the economy on? I mean, let's start there, and then we'll work our way up. So what is that competitive advantage?
Yeah, competitive advantage is also I think is relative. We've got mineral wealth. We've got a very young population, for example. So those are some advantages. The ports that we have, we've got a very well-developed financial sector, etc. So those are some of the bases upon which you can grow an economy. But the issue of competitive advantage, I think, was popularized by Michael Porter, and looking at what are the forces that are at play in an economy when there is a change of goods and services, so that there are bargaining powers. And I think you put it in the form of bargaining powers. How much bargaining power do suppliers have versus what buyers have? And that really is at the heart of it, is firstly creating, understanding that, and then saying, in order to increase your bargaining power, either as a supplier or as a customer, what do you need to do? What are the conditions that control that? And as South Africa, I think, part of if I give you a very simple example, for example, that if you look at, let's say in a desert where where I've got a bucket of water and I'm the only one with that water, I've got a lot of bargaining power and I've got a huge advantage in terms of being able to set the terms on which my water is going to be traded. But if the person that needs it has a gun, then my bargaining power sort of disappears, because they can simply demand that I give them that water. So as a country, we've got that issue, and I think it's a general problem that Africa has, that as much as we hold the world's mineral wealth, which theoretically should be our economic advantage, that we should be the wealthiest continent on the planet, because we don't have the big guns that the Western worlds and the Western powers, etc., have, we find ourselves at an economic disadvantage, and we're not able to properly leverage our our competitive advantages. And so in that context, I think some of the advantages that should be advantages cannot really be taken advantage of. And if anything, we're seeing, even when there is aid provided in investments, it comes with a lot of strings attached that in the end end up costing us a whole lot more than the actual aid that we received as a country.
And that's,
I think...
I mean, it's a bit worrying when we say that, our strong point is, of course, our youth. Whereas at the end of the day, unfortunately, the youth are the ones that are suffering the most. I mean, the youth are the ones that are, many would say, the victims of the poor quality of the country's education. That, a lot of people a lot of the youth are not benefiting from this. They don't go on to further their studies or get a skill. And it's the cycle of poverty that keeps on staying there for generation after generation. And we say that there's just no economic opportunities for them to enter into a workplace. So, when we talk about the youth being our strong point, you would think we would serve them better. So what do we do for the youth? I mean, how do we help the youth? Because it's the skills that we are lacking, and we keep on importing these skills from other countries.
Yeah, I mean, we've got this, I think, this focus in the country, for example, in the area where I specialize in small business development, where we got this drive to create and to promote youth-owned businesses. And I tend to believe that it's a wrong stance. I don't think that the responsibility for creating companies and creating jobs should be placed on the youth. I think we should be, as a society, focusing on developing skills of our youth, on giving them education, proper education, and then creating opportunities where they can start developing workplace experience, practical experience of what they have, and just, some of the soft skills that are required. And it takes time to build specialities, to build those sort of soft skills and things. And then when you start maturing, then you're in a position where you can say, I've got the requisite experience, I know this industry very well, I know these products very well, and I've got a good network, I can go and start a company. And if we focus on those types of people in the country, then they've got a much higher chance. Small businesses and startups have a very high failure rate. But when you have people that are skilled, that are very well experienced, that the country then invests in, they've got a much higher chance of actually creating successes and then creating job opportunities and opportunities for those youths to come in and develop their skills and things. So I think the focus that we place on the country in terms of companies, and I'm not saying young people cannot start successful companies, and we've got very good examples of it all across the world. But as a strategy, we just had I think a recent visit of a child prodigy, a 9-year-old professor or something, and when you see that, it's very encouraging and everything, but you can't then develop a policy around it. You want to have 9-year-old professors throughout the country. So yes, you have youths that can start businesses and become very successful, but as a policy focus, we need to focus on where does the skill, the know-how, and the capabilities and the competencies lie, where we can actually create new industries and start transforming some of the existing industries.
Yeah, I mean, you also look at our natural resources, and this is something that we've obviously been using for many years and benefiting from this. But it feels that government is not actually exploiting these natural resources enough to actually close that inequality gap and create these work opportunities. What are we doing wrong here? Obviously, there's exploitation happening at the mining level, and we hear about that all the time. But in terms of tapping into it, creating opportunities, and then, of course, not only exporting these minerals all the time, but actually doing the manufacturing here in the country, because that's always been at the heart of the issues that a lot of people complain of, is that we sell these resources out and then have to buy them back in, whereas we could actually control the whole chain, but we don't. So let's talk to that.
Yeah, so one of the big challenges that we have is in terms of manufacturing, and we focus on this as a country, as a starting point for transformation and for economy. But manufacturing requires very huge investments in capital, and you need to then have very low costs. It's a game of economies of scale. So you need to have access to very large markets, and then you need to have very low costs. And when you look at the Eastern countries and how they eventually developed their manufacturing capacity and capability, they had almost near slave labor circumstances where, if you remember in the 90s, the sweatshops that we had in China and some of the Eastern countries. And in our country, with our history, we have come to value, I think, worker rights and things as almost like a base, as a given, that you start from that point. So you cannot exploit labor to lower your costs so that you become internationally competitive. But unfortunately, we're competing with the world. So it turns out that in some cases, we can take the minerals out of our ground, but it actually costs less to ship them to China or whatever, and then to buy the finished product from them and try to compete with them. We then struggle. Technology is coming in and it's starting to level the playing fields a bit. But I think our focus on manufacturing as a country, as a starting point, we probably would have done better to focus. And here again, I'm talking about, if I was to say mix, looking at transformation and not just economic growth, but as part of it, because part of the economic growth is bringing in players, right? So when you look at household expenditure in the country, I think total annual household expenditure is about 1.8 trillion or so. Almost, if not more than about $1 trillion of that is, for example, black households, most of which are sitting in the townships. And we speak about the township economy, vitalizing it. But a big portion of the township economy is export of labor to the cities, to the industrial sites, where then that money comes back into the township. And how do you then capture that money? That's been, I think, part of the focus of some of the economic development sort of strategies. And for me, that's a starting point of saying, how do you do that? Because, for example, and where does the economic power then lie in this country? And economic power ultimately lies with the customer, where there is choice in terms of where you can buy, right? So if black households hold, let's say, $1 trillion in expenditure every year, the actual economic power in this country is held by black households. The fact that the control sits somewhere else is because black households then abdicate their responsibility and leave it to other people. And so you have these Pakistanis and things, and from time to time you get their shops being burnt. But township people, we keep buying from them, right? And so we sustain them and we give them that power. And I think the key thing for me there is, if you were to take the township, for example, the spaza shops, the retail outlets, the car washes, and help them to create associations at a local level, at a regional level, then you actually start creating a base from which you can control the power that is held. And in doing that, if you look at the taxi industry, for example, they're able to engage with government as a unit. And in that case, they're able to really exercise some bargaining power, whereas the other small businesses that go, individually to the National Empowerment Fund, to Department of Small Business, it's very difficult for them to get a result from it. So the critical thing is that unity, and I think if that unity happens, for example, if spaza shops that look around and say, How many tomatoes? How much do we spend as a total townships, plaza shops on tomatoes, right? And who do we buy them for? With that expenditure, you can actually then come together and say, let's create black farmers in the different regions where we are with our expenditure, right? Because you start controlling the using properly.
Indeed.
And you go
but
even
isn't that
further.
the role, if I may ask you, sorry, we're just going to run into big time problems. Isn't that the role of where the small business department comes in? I mean, is that why, don't we have a department of small business development that should be looking into these issues and implementing them?
Yeah, it's always, yes, it is, but it's always very difficult, I think, with government and things. I think more in the private sector. I would be looking more towards, say, the Black Business Council, for example, to advance those things, and the economic chambers and things that we have in the cities, etc., to do those things. And once you start exercising that power, just the final point is that understanding that expenditure and the power that you have, you're then in a situation to say, where do we bank our monies? Can we use this money to then fund these potential manufacturers or these potential farmers and our suppliers, create a cooperative bank, etc.? We just had this cooperative bank that tried to start, and they ran into some problem. This young lady, SABC, and Tabileng, and it was quite a shame because of the message that it sort of sends out.
Yeah.
It's really just about how it was approached.
Yeah.
But if it starts from the market, if it starts from the retail outlets, and you start to unify and control their power, and then engage with the consumers around, assisting, because then you're creating jobs directly for them through that manufacturing, because
Indeed.
those people that are around those manufacturing companies
and
come
that
from
gives
the
a bad,
communities.
exactly what you were saying. I mean, that example from Ntabaleng, I mean, that gives it a bad reputation, unfortunately, and that's a big problem. I just want to wrap this up literally in a minute. I just want to understand your perspective in the severity of where we as a country are finding ourselves. We have 18 million people, if I'm correct on the numbers here, that are living on social grants. We have a shrinking tax base of just 3 million people that are basically supporting the entire country, and bills are just getting higher and higher and higher, and I'm not sure the 3 million people can afford this anymore. What drastic measures are needed? Because this for me looks like a very, very dangerous situation.
Yeah, there are grants are demeaning. Welfare is demeaning to the recipients. If you're an able-bodied person, sound mind also, it's very demeaning to depend on people's charities. And I think one of the initial things, and unfortunately globally, it's not just in this country, grants are used to buy votes, and so it's very difficult to rein them in, especially when you have a situation where there's this votes are not assured, so you can't take them away. But there needs to be some obligation required, from the recipients to say, if you're healthy, you need to, what are you going to contribute to the country? Even if it's just 1 day a week or whatever, to your community, whatever it is, right? And that will start to change, I think, the mindset of people that are receiving grants. But to just give people charity and expect nothing from them, it's understandable. We need to give people that, kids are going hungry. We need to give household grants and child grants, etc. But when you get into a situation where somebody says, thanks for that grant, by the way, I'm going to need you to double that because I've got another child on the way. And it's a perpetual thing. And then after 18, now you've got the basic income grant coming. We're just creating, I think, a situation that is untenable for our country. So we really have to start thinking about what is the obligation that we place on the recipients of it.
All right, we've got to leave it there. Thank you, Karabo. Thanks so much for talking to us here on the program. That, of course, was Karabo Mashugane. He is a founder and managing director at 2020 Insight, a company focusing on small business development and finance, talking about the poverty cycle in South Africa.